2. The Ly-Cilph home planet was located in a galaxy far removed from the one which would ultimately host the human confederation. Strictly speaking, it wasn't a planet at all, but a moon, one of 29 orbiting a gas supergiant, a formidable orb 200,000 kilometers in diameter, itself a failed brown dwarf star. After its accretion had finished, it lacked enough mass for fusion ignition, but nonetheless its inexorable gravitational contraction generated a massive thermal output. What was ostensibly its night side fluoresced near the bottom end of the visible spectrum, producing a weary ember-like glow which fluctuated in continental-sized patterns as the dense turbulent clouds raged in never-ending cyclones. Across the day side, where lemon-shaded rays from the K4 primary sun fell, the storm bands shone a lambent salmon pink. There were 5 major moons, with the Ly-Cilph planet the fourth out from the cloud tops, and the only one with an atmosphere. The remaining 24 satellites were all barren rocks, captured asteroids, junk left over from the solar system's formation, all of them less than 700 kilometers in diameter. They ranged from a baked rock ball skimming 1,000 kilometers above the clouds, from which the metal ores had boiled away like a comet's volatiles, up to a glaciated planetoid in a retrograde orbit, 5.5 million kilometers out. Local space was hazardous in the extreme. A vast magnetosphere confined and channeled the supergiant's prodigious outpouring of charged particles, producing a lethal radiation belt. Radio emission was a ceaseless white noise howl. The 3 large moons orbiting below the Ly-Cilph homeworld were all inside the radiation belt, and completely sterile. The innermost of the 3 was chained to the ionosphere with a colossal flux tube, along which titanic energies sizzled. It also trailed a plasma torus around its orbital path, the densest ring of particles inside the magnetosphere's comprehensive embrace. Instant death to living tissue. The tidal-locked Ly-Cilph world coasted along 70,000 kilometers above the tenuous outer fringes of the magnetosphere, beyond the reach of the worst radiation. Occasional palpitations within the flux lines would bombard the upper atmosphere with protons and electrons, sending squalls of solar bright borealis lights slithering and twisting silently across the rusty sky. Atmospheric composition was an oxygen-nitrogen mix, with various sulphurous compounds, and an inordinately high water vapor level. Mist, fog, and stacked cloud layers were the norm. Proximity to the infrared glow of the supergiant gave it a perpetual tropical climate, with the warm, wet air of the near side constantly on the move, rushing around to the far side where it cooled, radiating its thermal load away into space, and then returning via storms which traversed the poles. Weather was a drab constant, always blowing, always raining, the strength of the gusts and downpours dictated by the orbital location. Night fell in one place at one time. On the far side, when supergiant and planet were in an inferior conjunction, and the hellish red cloudscape eclipsed the near side's brief glimpse of the sun. It was a cycle which was broken only once every 9 years, when a new force was applied to the timeless equation, a 4-moon conjunction which brought chaos and devastation to the surface with storms of biblical ferocity. The warmth and the light had incubated life on this world, as they had on countless billions throughout the universe. There had been no seas, no oceans, when the first migratory interstellar germ fell onto the pristine planet, rooting its way into the mucky stain of chemicals infecting the bubbling, muddy waters. Tidal forces had left a smooth surface, breaking down mountains, grinding away at the steps left over from the time of formation. Lakes, rivers, and floodplains covered the land, steaming and being rained on. There was no free oxygen back then. It was all combined with carbon. A solid stratum of white cloud ensured the infrared radiation found it hard to escape, even in the center of the far side. Temperatures were intolerably high. The first life, as always, was algae, a tough slime which spread through the water, seeping down rivers and streams to contaminate the lakes, hurried through the air by the tireless convection currents. It altered and adapted over geological eras, slowly learning to utilize the two contrasting light sources as an additional energy supply. Success, when it came, was swift, mere millennia. Oxygen poured forth, carbon was digested, the temperature fell, the rain quickened, thinning the clouds, clearing the sky. Evolution began once more. For millions of years, the planet's governing 9-year cycle was of no importance. Storms and hurricanes were an irrelevance to single-cell amoebas floating sluggishly through the lakes and rivers, nor did they matter to the primitive lichens which were creeping over the rocks. But the cells adrift in the water gradually began to form cooperative colonies, and specialization occurred. Jelly-like worms appeared in the lakes, brainless, instinct-driven, and metabolically inefficient, little more than mobile lichen. But it was a start. Birth and death began to replace fission as the premier method of reproduction. Mutations crept in, sometimes producing improvements, more often resulting in inviability. Failed strains were rapidly culled by merciless nature. Divergence appeared, the dawn of a million species. DNA strands lengthened, a chemical record of progress and blind alleys. Crawling creatures emerged onto the lakesides, only to be scalded by the harsh chemicals making up the atmosphere. Yet they persisted. Life was a steady progression, following a pattern which was as standard as circumstances would allow. There were no such things as ice ages to alter the direction which this world's creatures were taking, no instabilities causing profound climate changes, only the 9 yearly storms, appearing without fail, which became the dominant influence. The new animals' breeding cycles were structured around it. Plant growth was restricted by it. The planet matured into a jungle world, a landscape of swamps and lush verdancy, where giant ferns covered the surface from pole to pole, and were themselves webbed and choked with tenacious creepers reaching for the clear sky. Floating weeds turned the smaller lakes into vast marshlands. Elaborate rough flowers vied for the attention of insects and birds. Seed pods with skirts of hardened petals flew like kites through the air. Wood was non-existent, of course. Wood required decades of uninterrupted growth to form. Two wildly different flora genealogies sprang up, with the Terminator as an unbreachable dividing line and battleground. Farside plants adapted to the sun's yellow light. They were capable of tolerating the long nights accompanying conjunction, the cooler temperatures. Nearside was the province of red light, falling without end. Its black-leafed plants were taller, stronger, more vigorous, yet they were unable to conquer Farside. Night killed them. Yellow light alone was insufficient to drive their demanding photosynthesis, and the scattered refraction of red light by the thick atmosphere never carried far enough, haunting the land for a couple of 100 kilometers beyond the Terminator. The animals were more adaptive, ranging freely across Farside and Nearside. Dinosaur analogues never appeared. They were too big, requiring too much time to grow. Apart from bird analogues, lizard creatures with membranous wings, most animals were smallish, reflecting their aquatic heritage. All were cold-blooded, at home in the muddy streams and weed-clogged pools. They retained that ancestral trait out of pure necessity, for that was where their eggs were laid, buried deep and safe in the mud of the lake beds, hidden away from the worst ravages of the storm. That was how all life survived while the winds scoured the world, as seeds and eggs and spores, ready to surge forth when stability returned in a few short weeks. On such an inimical world, life can evolve in one of two ways. There are the defeated, littered on countless planets across the cosmos, weak, anemic creatures, huddled in their dead-end sanctuaries, a little protective niche in the local ecology, never rising above a rudimentary level, their very lack of sophistication providing them with the means of continuation. Or there are the triumphant, the creatures which refuse to be beaten, which fight tooth and nail and claw and tentacle against their adversity, those for which circumstances act as an evolutionary spur. The dividing line is thin. It might even be that a devastating storm every 8 years could bring genetic ruination. But 9 years, 9 proved enough time to ensure survival, allowing the denizens to rise to the challenge, rather than sink back into their ubiquitous mires. The Ly-Cilph claimed such a victory. A mere 800 million years after life had begun on their world, they had reached their pinnacle of evolution. They became transcendent entities. Their 9-year cycle starts in a fish form, hatching from the black egg clusters concealed below the mud. Billions of free-floating slugs emerge, 2 centimeters long, and are eaten by faster, meaner predators as they gorge themselves on the abundant sludge of decayed vegetation putrefying in the water. They grow and change over 3 years, losing their tails, developing a snail-like skirt. They cling to the bottom of their lakes, an ovoid body 90 centimeters high, with 10 tentacles rising up from the crown. The tentacles are smooth, 60 centimeters long, devoid of suckers, but with a sharp curved horn on the tip, and they're fast, exploding like a nest of enraged pythons to snatch their ignorant prey swimming overhead. When their full size has been reached, they slide up out of the water to range through the planet-wide jungle. Gills adapt to breathe the harsh, musky air. Tentacle muscles strengthen to support the drooping limbs away from the water's cozy buoyancy. And they eat, rummaging through the matted undergrowth with insistent horns to find the black, wizened, nut-like nodes that have been lying there neglected since the storm. The nodes are made up of cells saturated with chemical memory traces, memories containing information, the knowledge accumulated by the Ly-Cilph race throughout time. They bring understanding, an instant leap to sentience, and trigger the telepathic center of their brains. Now they have risen above a simple animal level of existence, they have much to converse about. The knowledge is mainly of a philosophical nature, although mathematics is highly developed. What they know is what they have observed and speculated upon and added to with each generation. Farside night acts as a magnet as they gather to observe the stars, eyes and minds linked by telepathy, acting as a gigantic multi-segment telescope. There is no technology, no economy. Their culture is not orientated towards the mechanical or materialistic. Their knowledge is their wealth. The data processing capacity of their linked minds far exceeds that of any electronic computer system, and their perception is not limited to the meager electromagnetic wavelengths of the optical bands. Once awoken, they learn. It is their purpose. They have so little time in their corporeal form, and the universe they find themselves in, the splendor of the gas supergiant and its multifarious satellites, is large. Nature has ordained them as gatherers of knowledge. If life has a purpose, they speculate, then it must be a journey to complete understanding. In that respect, intellect and nature have come to a smooth concordance. In the 9th year after their hatching, the 4 large innermost moons line up once more. The distortion they cause in the supergiant's magnetosphere acts like an extension to the flux tube. The agitated particles of the ionosphere, which use it as a conduit up to the first moon's plasma torus, now find themselves rising higher, up to the 2nd moon, then the 3rd, higher still, fountaining out of the magnetosphere altogether. The Ly-Cilph world swings round into their path. It is not a tight directed beam. Up at the mushrooming crown, the protons and electrons and neutrons have none of the energy they possessed when the roiling flux lines flung them past the first moon. But as always, it is the sheer scale of events within the gas supergiant's domain which proves so overwhelming. The Ly-Cilph world takes 10 hours to traverse through the invisible cloud of ions loitering outside the flux lines. In that time, the energy which floods into the atmosphere is more than sufficient to destroy the equilibrium of the slowly circulating convection currents. The deluge arrives at the end of the planet's one and only mating season. The Ly-Cilph and their non-sentient cousins have produced their eggs and secreted them into the lake beds. Plants have flowered and scattered their seeds across the landscape. Now there is only the prospect of death. When the first titanic bursts of azure lightning break overhead, the Ly-Cilph stop their analyzing and deliberations, and begin to impart all they know into the empty cells of the nodes which have grown out of their skin like warts around the base of their tentacles. The winds howl, voicing the planet's torment. Gusts are strong enough to break the meter-thick stems of the fern trees. Once one goes, it starts a domino effect in the jungle. Destruction spreads out in vast ripples, looking like bomb blasts from above. Clouds are torn apart by the violence, reduced to cotton tufts, spinning frantically in the grip of small, ferocious whirlwinds. Micro-typhoons plunge back and forth, accelerating the obliteration of the jungle. All the while, the Ly-Cilph remain steadfast, their adhesive skirts anchoring them to the ground as the air around them fills with broken fronds and shredded leaves. The nodes, now saturated with their precious heritage, drop off like ripe fruit. They will lie hidden amongst the grass and roots for another 3 years. Nearside is ablaze with potent light storms. High above the tattered clouds, the aurora borealis forms a veil across the sky, a garish mother-of-pearl haze, riddled with thousands of long, lurid scintillations, like giant shooting stars. Beyond that, the conjunction is joined, 3 moons sliding into alignment, bathed in an eerie trillion-amp phosphorescence, an epicenter to one of the gas supergiant's planet-swallowing cyclones. The particle jet has reached its zenith. The flux tube's rain of energy penetrates the tormented lower atmosphere. It is embraced by the Ly-Cilph. Their minds consume the power, using it to metamorphose once again. The nodes brought them sentience. The supergiant's surplus energy brings them transcendence. They leave the chrysalis of the flesh behind, shooting up the stream of particles at light speed, space free and eternal. The liberated minds swarm above their abandoned world for several days, watching the storms abate, the clouds reform, the old convection currents return to their familiar courses. The Ly-Cilph have achieved incorporeality, but their perspective, shaped by the formative material existence, remains unchanged. As before, they deemed the purpose of their life is experience, perhaps eventually to be followed by understanding. The difference is that they are no longer restricted to a single world and brief glimpses of the stars. Now the entire universe is laid out before them. They wish to know it all. They begin to drift away from the odd planet which birthed them, tentatively at first, then with greater boldness, dispersing like an expanding wave of eager ghosts. One day they will return to this point, all the generations of Ly-Cilph that ever lived. It will not happen while the primary star still burns. They will travel until they meet the boundary of the universe as it contracts once more, following the galactic superclusters as they fall into the reborn dark mass at the center, the cosmic egg regathering all it has lost. Then they will be back, congregating around the black star husk, sharing the knowledge they have brought, searching through it for that elusive, ultimate understanding. And after understanding, they will know what lies beyond, and with that, a hope of a further switch to yet another level of existence. Possibly the Ly-Cilph will be the only entities to survive the present universe's final reconfiguration. But until then, they are content to observe and learn. Their very nature precludes them from taking part in the myriad dramas of life and matter unfolding before their ethereal senses. Or so they believe.